I didn't have the motivation to try to trace my ancestry back to Africa. Had no motivation to trace my ancestry to Europe, and had no knowledge that some of my ancestry actually was in this country before Christopher Columbus got here. So what motivated me? In the summer of 1990, I read a book. The name of the book was Somerset Homecoming, and was written by a woman by the name of Dorothy Sproul Redford, who started tracing her family tree in 1967. And after about 10 years, she discovered her ancestors had been slaves on a plantation in the same county that she was living in. She was in a library tracing information about the owner of her ancestors, and she ran across a deed for the Somerset Plantation. And immediately she recognized that term is familiar. Why? And then she thought every time she drove to this library, she passed this billboard on the side of the road that said Somerset Plantations, antebellum home, next turn off. So she jumped in her car, went to the Somerset Plantation, discovered that many of the records had survived the Civil War, and using those records, she traced not only her ancestry, but the ancestry of all 300 slaves on that plantation back into the 1700s, and organized a one-day reunion of the descendants of those slaves, and 3,000 people came.
Wow.
That's incredible.
Great.
I said, well, if she can do that, I should be able to trace one line back into the slavery era. So I set out with the goal of one day being able to walk on the land where my slave ancestors walked at the outbreak of the Civil War. Now, I haven't achieved that goal yet, but I have done it twice. And the first time I did it with my father. It was about 4 miles from where he was born, and he was born in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. I never visited Tahlequah, Oklahoma growing up. I was born in Arkansas, about a mile from where my mother was born, on a farm. I used to go back to Arkansas all the time. I really didn't know that much about my father's family until I started this process. So the first place that I was able to achieve that goal was in my father's line, where my father was born, in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. And the plantation was a plantation called Rose Cottage. And the owner of that plantation was a guy by the name of John Ross. And John Ross was the chief of the Cherokee tribe from 1827 until his death in 1866.
Long time.
And my great-great-grandparents, Johnson Meigs and Rosanna Ross, were slaves to Chief John Ross.
Wow.
So we met with a descendant of Chief John Ross's, and she took us out to where Rose Cottage had existed. Today, it's a hole in the ground because it was burned down during the Civil War by John Ross's arch enemy, a guy by the name of Stan Wadey, who was the general in charge of the Indian troops in the Civil War.
Wow.
So I actually had enough information to be able to trace, to identify where my ancestors had been slaves about 90 days after I started this process. So I started December 1st. By the 1st of March, I knew that Chief John Ross was the owner of my great-great-grandparents. These are some little known facts about the Cherokees. Many of them owned slaves. In fact, 10% of the 16,000 Cherokees that were on this Trail of Tears were people of African descent. And to give you an idea how that compares, the African American population of the United States today is recognized to be about 10% of the total American population. Cherokees fought in the Civil War, both for the North and the South. Many migrated before the Trail of Tears. Trail of Tears was over the winter of 1838-39. But there was about 25% of the Cherokee Nation already in what is now Oklahoma. At that time, it was Indian Territory. Some became U.S. citizens and remained behind in Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, where the Cherokees were located prior to the Trail of Tears. Early on, the Cherokees participated in an Indian slave trade. And in fact, the tribe just to their east, the Catawbas, for many years was thought to have been wiped out because of that. But they were not. Many whites were adopted as Cherokee citizens. And the last one here is something that a lot of people don't know, and that is the chief of the Cherokees, who was John Ross, 7/8 white. Here's a picture I found that actually, that's not a picture, it's a painting that is at the Gilcrease Museum in Oklahoma. And looking at the picture, you can identify several people that have African features in it. These are two pictures of Chief John Ross. A young Chief John Ross, a little bit older Chief John Ross. Now, how many of you think that he looks Indian?
The left one kind of looks a little bit.
Well, that one kind of looks. He was a young man. He was a statesman at that time. He was the chief, but his first language really was English. His father was born in England. His mother's father was born in England, and his mother's father was born in England. So his first language was English, and so when he gave his speeches to the nation, he had an interpreter converted to Cherokee.
Wow.
Why? Because Cherokee spokesman was, being able to speak or make up. The oratory skills of Cherokee was an esteemed skill, and he knew he didn't have it. So that's why he spoke in English. He's also considered to be the father of the Cherokee Constitution, written in 1827. Picture of the gentleman on the right, a guy by the name of Return Jonathan Meigs. And you might think that, boy, is that a unique name or what? He was a hero of the American Revolution. He captured some English troops on Long Island. He was a colonel in the army at that time. He became one of the first settlers of Northwest Territory, which became Ohio. There actually were 9 Return Jonathan Meigses. And this particular one was appointed Cherokee Indian agent by President Thomas Jefferson in 1801. And he died, and he had that job until 1823 when he died. In the past, I used to display my family tree until someone told me that I have so much information in it that someone could steal my identity if they wanted. So I stopped showing the family tree. I told you what started my research in 1990. Now, I did know some information. I remember a story my father told when I was about 10 years old. And that story was Okay. His grandfather, an individual by the name of Samuel Meigs, at the age of 10, stole his master's horse and rode it over to the Cherokee Nation, and they adopted him into the tribe, and that's how he got his freedom. Well, early on, I started to doubt that story because that person was probably the grandson of Chief John Ross. The person that he ran away from was probably the grandson of Chief John Ross. And if he had done that, Chief John Ross would have sent him back. But as I learned more and more history, I found out that Samuel Meigs turned 10 around the start of the Civil War. He turned 11 in November of 1861. There had been a lot of fighting going on in western Arkansas and in the Indian Territory at that time, so it would have been easy, not easy, but if there was fighting going on near where I was, and I was 10 years old, and there was a horse over there, I'm jumping on that horse and getting out of town. So he probably did run away at the age of 10. He was adopted into the tribe, as were the descendants of all ex-slaves of the Cherokees in 1867 as a result of the Treaty of 1866, ending the war between the Cherokees who entered the war fighting for the South and the United States. When I first started this process, I started at the LA Downtown Library. There was no way that I was going to try to find information on microfilm. So I went to the LA Downtown Library and I started looking at books. At the LA Downtown Library, there actually was an 1860 census index for Arkansas, and there were a couple of Meigses in there. As happenstance or luck or fortune would have it, there actually was a genealogy book on the Meigs family at the LA Downtown Library. That's how I know there were 9 returned Jonathan Meigses. I also learned in that book that a returned Jonathan Meigs married Jane Ross, who was the daughter of Chief John Ross. So I said, there is a connection.
That's not too
There was a
right
book,
on his face, is it? If he looks at
a
it.
biography actually, entitled Chief John Ross by Gary Moulton. Gary Moulton also published 2 volumes of the letters of Chief John Ross. And those letters were extremely valuable to me because I pretty much knew what Chief John Ross was doing from about 1830 until his death in 1866 because of those letters. There were several books written on not just Africans and Cherokees, but Africans and other members of the 5 civilized tribes. A guy by the name of Daniel Littlefield wrote a book entitled Cherokee Freedmen that covered the period 1866 to 1907. He also wrote a book, Africans and Creeks, Africans and Seminoles, and Chickasaw Freedmen. Now, I'm going to show you a little bit later on what I found on the final rolls. And if you have an ancestor that was enrolled in the final rolls of the 5 civilized tribes, that would have taken place in the period 1898 to 1907. You'll find out all of this information that I'll show you a little bit later on. This is the nature of early African and Native American contact. There actually were maroon settlements beginning about 50 miles inland from the Atlantic coast. Maroon settlements were settlements of runaway African slaves that that created a settlement, and these settlements actually were all over North America, all over Mexico, all over South America in the early years of settlement. And by the way, let me introduce my friend that I brought with me, Dr. Tony Humber. Now, I wanted her to see this presentation because she has been researching the African presence in Mexico and in South America. And while they are different, they are similar. So, getting back to the presentation, slaves were captured during Indian raids on white settlements. There actually were slaves and employees of traders that were in the Cherokee Nation as early as 1797. And there were free blacks who intermarried with the Cherokees. On the southern plantation, you had Cherokees that were basically that were introduced back into slavery that by recapture of runaways and capture of the children of runaways. First documented presence of African contact with the Cherokees was 1540. Fernando de Soto was looking for gold, and he took a Cherokee woman as a captive to make sure that where the Cherokees said he could find gold, he could. And with De Soto, there were some slaves, and one of those slaves helped her escape. So that was the first one that was documented. One can find the extent of African slavery among the Cherokees because most people don't even know about the slavery among Cherokees, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Seminoles. Some don't even believe it when I show them the data. But people of African descent are identified in the Cherokee census of 1825, the census of 1835, and even in the U.S. Census of 1860. It was interesting to me that Cherokees were not listed as citizens in the 1860 census. They were not listed as citizens of Arkansas. However, all of their slaves were identified and listed in the slave schedules of 1860. And I said, I wonder, did Arkansas use those numbers to increase their congressional representation in Congress? My grandfather, my dad's dad, was born in 1889 in what at that time was the Cherokee Nation. When he was born, he was not a U.S. citizen. He was a Cherokee citizen. He did not become a U.S. citizen until 1907, when all Cherokees became U.S. citizens. That's a thought that I never had until way after I started this process. And my grandfather was an individual of African descent. He was not a native Cherokee. Identify some of the similarities and the differences. Both were matrilineal cultures. Both practiced polygamy, and the women participated in the governance. Men would meet and decide what the village or the tribe was going to do. And as soon as they came to agreement, they would go back and tell the villagers what they had decided to do. And if the women disagreed, they would say, no, we're not doing that. And they'd have to go back to council again and decide what it was they were going to do. In Africa, people of African descent were farmers, or people in Africa were farmers and herdsmen. And most Native Americans, now this is not quite as true for the Cherokees, were hunter-gatherers. There was pretty much no purpose served by having a slave in the Native American tribe. The women were the one that grew the crops, vegetables, or either grew or gathered the crops. And so men looked upon that as women's work, and they did not hold agriculture in esteem, whereas people of African descent held agriculture in esteem. However, the women, let me back up. Most of the, many of the Cherokee names were of Scots-Irish origin. And so many of the Scots-Irish that migrated to North America after the American Revolution, they were not going to get any land from the King of England. But all they had to do was to marry a Native American, and they could plot out as much land as they wanted and grow crops. So with them, having slaves became important. These were some initial secondary sources that I read, and one of the major benefits of these books to me is that these historians generally had in their footnotes the source of their information, and every so often there would be a reference to a Meigs in one of these books, and it would tell me where that information had originated, and that allowed me to find the original records. These are some of the primary sources that I use. There were actually ex-slave narratives that were created in the time frame 1937, and these were, for the most part, stories, oral history, provided by first-hand accounts of slavery by people who had been born at the time of slavery. Indian pioneer papers were also created in the period 1937, and these basically were WPA or Work Progress Administration projects to employ unemployed writers. Indian pioneer papers was document first-hand accounts of life on the plains among Indians and pioneers. Where I obtained a lot of information about my ancestors was the final rolls of the 5 civilized tribes, and I'll show you one of the records that I was able to find here. The final rolls of the 5 civilized tribes was not the last one. There was one called the Gion Miller Rolls of Cherokees that was created after that. Jane Ross, the daughter of Chief John Ross, her first husband was Returned Jonathan Meigs. He died on the way to California during the California Gold Rush. And then she married a guy by the name of Andrew Nave, who happened to have been her first cousin. So one of the things that I discovered was that the Andrew Nave papers had been donated by descendants of his to the Northeastern Oklahoma State University, which is a state university physically located in Tahlequah. So the first time I went to Tahlequah, that's why I went. I wanted to look at those papers. The John Ross papers were published in 2 volumes about this thick. There was also Cherokee Indian Agency records as part of the National Archives, documented 1801 to 1835, and then there was the 1835 Cherokee census, and in that census it was identified that Chief John Ross at the time of that census owned 18 slaves. Okay, this is a copy of what's called a census card. In the final rows of the 5 civilized tribes, there was a card like this, or very similar to this, prepared for everyone that was included in the final rows. What was its purpose? Well, in 1898, the Curtis Act was passed, and the major purpose was to do away with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. It had become quite expensive, and they felt that if they got away with that, they could save a lot. If they could eliminate the Bureau of Indian Affairs, they could save a lot of money. So they were going to then identify all of the members of those 5 tribes, allot their land out to them, make them U.S. citizens, and what land was left over, they would open up for settlement. Well, the Bureau of Indian Affairs was the organization that was preparing these records. They thought it was going to take a couple of years to extinguish the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Well, it started out in 1898, didn't conclude until 1907, so it cost a lot more. And guess what? Is there still a Bureau of Indian Affairs?
Yes.
Yes, there is. So it didn't serve its purpose, but it did provide me a lot of information about my ancestors. The first person on this list is Samuel Meigs. Samuel Meigs is my great-grandfather. He is the one who ran away from his owner into the Cherokee Nation in 1860, 1861. His wife, Ida, my great-grandmother, I met her.
Oh.
I was 16 when she died. Now that's the good news. Bad news is I never asked her any questions.
Always have.
Now I actually have been able to find out some information about her, but how much more information I could have. Right. Johnson Meigs, right here, that's my grandfather. And it shows that Samuel Meigs, at the outbreak of the Civil War, was a slave of John Meigs. Now, who was John Meigs? His name was John Ross Meigs. He was the oldest son of returned Jonathan Meigs and Jane Ross Meigs. And he actually migrated to Arkansas. He married a woman in Arkansas in 1858, migrated to Arkansas, and that's where he was living at the time the Civil War broke out. There's some invaluable notes on here. Down at the bottom, it says number 2 was on the 1880 roll as Ida Whitmire. I didn't know that. So I went to the 1880 roll and I found Ida Whitmire. She was 21. She had a daughter named Alice. So I said, Dad, did you ever hear that you had that your grandmother had a daughter named Alice? He said, oh yeah. My great grandmother Ida was a widow at 21. So Alice was a daughter by a previous marriage. So Dad remembered that Ida had a child before they got married, and Samuel had a child before they got married. So I had thought they had 13 children. Between the two of them, they actually had 15 children. I would not have found that if that person completing this application had not put that note on this census record. Now this shows the name of the mother and the father of everybody on that previous page. And it shows that Samuel Meigs' father was Johnson Meigs, another Johnson Meigs, not my grandfather. And his mother was Rosanna Meigs. It shows that Johnson Meigs was deceased at the time that this record was created, and so was Rosanna. they both were slaves of John Meigs. Now, I actually was able to find siblings of Samuel Meigs. One was a full sister. About 3 or 4 were half brothers. Rosanna was the mother, but the father was a guy by the name of Isaac Ross. And so the various people, the brothers and sisters of Samuel Meigs, alternatively identified the owner of their parents as John Meigs, Jane Meigs or Jane Nave, or John Ross. Now this slide I created back when the only way you're going to be able to do this is by researching microfilm. It's so much easier today. But there's some advantages and disadvantages of being able to research all this information on the internet. Major advantage of the records being on microfilm is many times you have to research a whole lot of information before you can key in on what you're looking for. Whereas now with all the indices, you can miss a lot of information as you might go through. But back then you had to look at about 3 different sets of records to find that census card. But once you found the information on that census card, you could, and you still can do this today, send away to the National Archives in Fort Worth, which is the southwest region, and request a copy of the whole file from them, and they'll give you a copy of the file for $35. Back then it cost 10. Now people that applied were either accepted or rejected or coded as doubtful. If they were coded as doubtful, then they later researched those records and put them either into the accepted category or the rejected category. The beauty is that even if the person was rejected, if they filled out an application, you could find the same information whether it's a doubtful record or a rejected record. And by the way, 1900 census of the 1900 U.S. Census of Indian Territory includes all members of all of the 5 civilized tribes. So if you have an ancestor that was living in Oklahoma, if they were on the 1900 U.S. Census of Indian Territory, the odds are pretty high that they completed an application.
Could I ask you a question? What are
Yes.
the 5 civilized tribes?
I'm sorry, I generally mentioned that right at the beginning. Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole.
Oh, okay.
The Seminole broke away from the Creek, so at one time the Creek and the Seminole were the same tribe. The Chickasaw and the Choctaw at one time were the same tribe. All 4 of those tribes that I just mentioned have similarities in their language. The Cherokees is different. And it's believed that the Cherokees were affiliated with the Iroquois. I haven't seen proof, but they do not belong. They're not affiliated with the other 4 tribes. The other 4 of the 5 civilized tribes in language, anyway. The Guion-Miller roll was created after the final rolls, and its purpose was to identify descendants of those Cherokees that were living in the Cherokee Nation in the East before the Trail of Tears so that they could pay them some reparation money, because it was felt that the $5 billion that they got for their lands during the Cherokee removal was really not enough. So they decided to give them some more money, and those people had to be able to prove that they were descended from someone living in the Cherokee Nation in the East. So they basically would have to trace their ancestry to the 1835 Cherokee census. These are all the locations you can find Cherokee records. Every state has an archive and or a historical society. National Archives is in Washington, D.C., but there are regional archives, and the regional archives have data that is not duplicated in Washington, D.C. LA Family History Library. LA Family, what I call the Mormon Genealogical Library, they call the Family History Library. And I think they're changing the name to Family Search Library.
You're right.
I think
They're-
because
they're-
their Family Search is what's online.
Yeah.
What's that?
Family Search is what it's called online.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think that's
And
right.
FamilySearch.org is the Mormons' website
Yeah.
with all of the information of genealogical value, and it's free. So I know the U.S. Census, all of the U.S. censuses that are legally available are on FamilySearch.org. 1950 just came out. It's the first census that I will be in. Once I get indexed, I will find it. At the LA Downtown Library, there is a genealogical section of the library, and it's pretty much the entire bottom floor of the library. And there's a lot of genealogical books of genealogical value there. A lot of the books are being done away with or moved, in the case of the Family History Library, being moved to Salt Lake City because they're telling me that all of this information is online. I thought I'd list all of, or almost all of the Cherokee rolls that exist. And the U.S. Census is taken every 10 years. And between 1817 and 1910, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 censuses of the Cherokee Nation that was taken. And Google is all of our friends. So you can find out where a lot of this information exists using Google. So I Googled Cherokee rolls, and I got all of these subtitles. That census card that I showed of my great-grandfather, great-grandmother, and all of their children, you can access that information on the Oklahoma Historical Society's website, which is oakhistory.org. And I think it's also now available in the National Archives database, which is archives.gov. Now, that census card that I showed, that is a census card that is available for the Cherokees, the Creeks, the Choctaws, the Chickasaws, and the Seminoles. And one of the things that I have come to conclude is that if one has ancestors that live in Oklahoma, they probably are affiliated some way or another with one of those 5 tribes. Told you the story that got me started, or that I started researching, was a story that my father said back in the 1950s. I think it was 1954. It was interesting how it came about. We were visiting my grandmother, who still was living on her farm in Arkansas. They had no electricity, no running water. So what do you think they did after dinner? Sat on the front porch and told stories. And if kids were around, they always told some stories that were scary as all get out. But my grandmother, my mother, they tell these stories about the family, and I think my dad felt a little bit left out, so he threw that story in about his grandfather. 1981, I discovered, returned Jonathan Meigs was appointed Cherokee Indian agent by Thomas Jefferson. And I discovered that because I was involved in a project in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where one of my cousins lived, and they showed me this book. And I said, I wonder if there is any relationship between that Cherokee Indian agent and Dad's family. And I asked Dad, I said, weren't there other Meigses that lived in Tahlequah? He said, yeah. I said, do you know whether the two families? No, they were a different family. You don't know whether there was any connection? I don't think so. So that was the story I got from him. So when I mentioned early that the first time actually the second time I went to Tahlequah, I went with my dad. By this time, I don't care what it was that I had discovered. My father told that story just like he had discovered it himself.
That's nice.
So it was July 1995 that Dad and I visited Tahlequah. That was my second time there. The first time I went by myself. I went there to look at the Andrew Nave papers. And so I actually only spent one day there. That's not true. I got there Friday morning, and I didn't leave until Sunday morning. So I actually spent 2 days there. But by the second day, pretty much everybody in Tahlequah knew I was there.
Right? That's so great.
I was I went there to look at the Nave papers and to find my grandmother's gravesite. My dad's mother died when he was 11. And actually 2 people drove me by that cemetery, and I didn't think that was it because the tombstones were much bigger than I expected them to be. Finally, I did go and found my grandmother's gravesite. Okay, that's my story about Cherokees. If you have connections to the Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, or Seminole tribes, that's probably the kind of process that you would go through for any of those tribes when you start out not knowing anything. Yeah. That's the way it was. December 1st, 1990, I started out not knowing anything. Thank you.
Thank you.